What if I told you that one of the most powerful empires in history was once ruled by a 14-year-old boy who declared himself a goddess, wore a wedding veil, and held the world's first same-sex royal marriage nearly 2,000 years ago? This is not fantasy, this is not fiction. This is the true and haunting story of Emperor Elagabalus, Rome's most scandalous ruler, a divine bride, a tragic god, and a shadow the empire tried to erase. But history remembers, and tonight, so will you. The crown of perfume and fire. In the year 218, Rome crowned a god by mistake. They believed they were placing the imperial laurel on the brow of a noble boy, a teenager born of high Syrian blood. His name was Varius of Italy, but history would not remember him by that name. The world would come to know him, whisper about him as 14 and already trained in silk more than sword. 14 and already steeped in ritual, incense, and visions that would come to haunt the empire. He was just 14. He wore robes dyed with Tyrian purple, rare and forbidden to all but he entered not as a soldier, but as an oracle. 14 and already a high priest of a foreign god. He arrived in Rome not with legions, but with ritual dances, and slaves bearing gold-veined fabrics never before seen in the capital. The Senate held its tongue. The generals kept their swords sheathed. They hoped perhaps the boy would be molded, shaped by power into a proper Caesar. And Rome watched, that he spoke to flames, that his soul had no shape, no fixed gender, no human master, that he would be both ruler and priest, both bride and groom, both everything and nothing. Some clapped, some bowed, but most whispered. They had heard rumors, of course, that the boy emperor believed he was the earthly vessel of a god from the east. Civil war had drained her strength, but Elagabalus did not mold. He burned. In his first month, he declared Jupiter Rome's king of gods. In his place, he raised a black conical stone, said to have fallen from the heavens. The stone, sacred to Elagabalus, was housed in a golden chariot and pulled through the streets to frenzied chants. Senators were ordered to kneel before it. Vestal virgins wept as their sacred rites were rewritten by a boy barely older than themselves. And then came the silks, the cosmetics, the perfumes thick as fog. Elagabalus began appearing in court with painted cheeks, a voice softened by song. He wore veils like bridal lace. He rejected Roman armor, declaring it a costume of violence. His generals watched in frozen silence. But beneath the incense and whispers, there was strategy. Elagabalus was not mad. He was deliberate. Every gesture, every ritual was not an accident. It was inversion, a ritual reversal of Rome itself. He believed that the empire had grown sick from within, that its gods were dying, that its men had grown blind with pride, and that through ritual, he would purge it, break it down, and rebuild it anew. And to do that, he would begin with marriage, not to a noble woman, not to a daughter of generals, but to a man. When he awoke, he ordered the man brought to his chambers. Within a week, Heracles had been bathed in oils, dressed in gold, and placed at the emperor's side. A palace guard, a charioteer, a slave, by Roman eyes. It is said that when Elagabalus first saw him naked, victorious after a race to the boy, he declared the wedding by decree, and Rome for the first time in its bloody, brutal history, the words, "The emperor is the bride," not as a consort, as a husband. The Senate was not informed. The public was not prepared. But Elagabalus did not care. The groom of the gods. They say the palace smelled of roses that day. Not incense, not sweat, but roses. Thousands of petals crushed underfoot, perfuming the corridors of the imperial home as if the gods themselves had walked through it barefoot. Servants whispered that this was no ordinary feast. Sun-kissed and trembling in his sandals, the charioteer looked less like a groom than a prisoner. Not because he didn't love Elagabalus, no one could say for certain, but because in that room, let them hear it, surrounded by generals and senators and women biting their lips to suppress gasps, Heracles' new musicians played harps from behind crimson curtains. Candles burned in bowls of oil. Dances neither fully man nor fully woman spun like ghosts in the lamplight, and in the center of it all stood the emperor. He took Heracles' hand not with the gesture of a ruler binding a servant, but like a child clinging to something only he believed in. Then, before the gods, the bride, the offering, he spoke, not in armor, not in laurels, but in a veil, a bridal veil. White silk fell across Elagabalus' shoulders, stitched with thread of gold, embroidered with phoenix. His eyes, skull-dark and unblinking, scanned the chamber not with fear but with certainty. There was no ceremony, no priest of Jupiter. This wedding would be blessed by the sun, by the god he claimed lived within him. And then came abroad. This was not just a marriage, this was a war. Elagabalus stepped forward. "Let Rome know. Only silence. I am no man, and he is my husband." There was no applause. And then the music resumed, louder, faster, a celebration no one asked for, drowning the thunder of collective disbelief. Some senators left, others stayed, out of fear, out of morbid fascination, or perhaps because they sensed what others refused to see, that this was no act of rebellion. This was a ritual, you see. In his mind, Elagabalus wasn't just shattering taboos. He was reenacting the sacred marriage between heaven and earth, between the sun god and the mortal vessel. His union with Heracles was a cosmic reenactment, a divine necessity. In the Senate, in the barracks, in the temples, the emperor was no longer a boy to be pitied. He was a force that threatened the pillars of Roman identity, and even those who had smiled politely at the ceremony now tightened their lips. By marrying as the bride, he believed he was closing a rift between man and God. But Rome did not care for rituals it could not control. That night, while rose petals were swept from the marble floors, the whispers began. But Elagabalus was not done. Laughed when statues of Jupiter were quietly removed from his view, because to Elagabalus it wasn't mockery, it was freedom. And somewhere in the shadows of the forum, the question began to form, not when he would fall, but how loud the fall would be. In the weeks that followed, he demanded to be addressed not as Dominus Lord but as Lady. He wore corsets, earrings, and breast prosthetics made of fine leather. He insisted on being called the wife of Heracles, and offered gold to any physician who could perform what he called the Great Transformation. And perhaps most dangerously of all, he laughed. He laughed in court, laughed when military tribunes refused to meet his gaze. But to Rome, it was an insult that bled. The empire was watching. So were the gods. The blood of the laurel in the weeks after the wedding, Rome held its breath. The empire did not fall. The Tiber still flowed. The sun still rose. But beneath the marble and the perfume, something had changed. Because Elagabalus was no longer performing, he believed he was divine. Not a metaphor, not a symbol, a god. And Heracles, once a humble palace god, now ruled beside him not with wisdom or power, but with jealousy. He became the emperor's shadow, watching, commanding, punishing. Those who smiled too long at Elagabalus were whipped and doomed. Those who dared speak of restoring order were made to vanish. Together, they danced through the palace like two flames trapped in the same glass, bright, wild, beautiful. At night, Elagabalus held private ceremonies. They asked for blood, chickens at first, then lambs, then lions imported from Numidia sacrificed beneath a painted dome under moonlight. It was said that he would smear the sacred stone of Elagabal with warm entrails, whispering in a language no Roman priest could understand. Rome would not resist. It would submit, not to violence, but to the light. He told his inner circle the truth. He was preparing for rebirth. He had tasted the power of thrones, of silk sheets, of golden sandals, but he did not worship the gods. He worshipped control, and the more Elagabalus slipped into prophecy, the more Heracles feared losing him to madness, to priests, to the shadows that haunted his husband's dreams. A cosmic transformation. He even struck a senator across the face for calling the emperor boy. In the north, the Germanic tribes laughed at the empire's softness, but it was not foreign swords that would endanger the emperor. It was the Senate. He spoke of a coming eclipse, a moment when the old gods would shudder, and a new sun would rise his sun. But Heracles did not believe in light. He had risen from nothing, a stable boy, a charioteer. He began sleeping with a dagger beneath his pillow. He forced the servants to taste every drink before it touched Elagabalus's lips. Elagabalus said nothing. But for the first time, the sacred stone gave him no sign. The incense did not rise. The oil stayed cool. Even the sun, once his symbol, now felt dimmer. Every ritual ended in silence, because somewhere, deep in the silks and the visions and the whispers, he began to suspect what the gods had long known. He tried weeping. He sacrificed black bulls and white doves and golden-threaded cloth, but no voice answered. Love does not protect emperors, it destroys them. In the east, Rome's soldiers murmured. The legions in Syria questioned why they bled for a man who called himself a woman. A letter was passed, a coin refused, a gesture misread. That's all it took. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, began to whisper. Could the boy be removed? Could the old gods be restored? And in this silence, one name was spoken more and more. Alexander, a cousin of Elagabalus, 15 years old. Handsome, quiet, normal, a shadow forming behind the throne. Elagabalus, sensing something, turned to his gods for guidance. He tried fasting, only Heracles still watching, still clinging, still afraid. And as Rome prepared its final betrayal, the boy who once called himself divine looked up at the temple ceiling and whispered a single question to the dark. If I am the sun, then why am I always cold? The last bride of Rome. By the spring of 222, Rome had made its decision. The Senate no longer debated. The generals no longer questioned. The gods no longer spoke. They would not let him finish the ritual. The boy who wore a bridal veil in place of a crown, who called himself divine and danced barefoot through the marble halls of Jupiter's temple, was now a problem with a solution. And the solution was waiting in the barracks. The Praetorian Guard, those sworn to protect the emperor with blood and blade, had made their choice. Behind closed doors, over plates of cold figs and wine soured with dust, they passed their oaths to a new figure. Alexander Severus, Elagabalus's younger cousin, the safe one, the quiet one, the Roman one. He would restore tradition. He would undo the shame. He would be predictable in the way his gods began to look through him rather than at him. In the silence, after his laughter, Elagabalus knew. Somewhere beneath the silks, beneath the paint, beneath the hysteria and hunger and rituals soaked in blood, he believed the sun would rise for him one more time. He saw it in the way the servants no longer bowed as deeply. But he refused to run. He still believed. So he threw one final celebration. No guests, no senators, no priests. Just him, Heracles, and a chamber filled with rose petals and bronze mirrors. It is said he wore white that night, purer than before, as if becoming light itself. He danced for his god, for the stone, for the dream he once had of becoming everything Rome was too afraid to name. Silent, faces wrapped in cloth to shield from the scent of incense and something worse. They broke down the doors. Elagabalus did not scream. He tried to speak, to chant perhaps, but they beat him until the words stopped forming. Heracles held him as he cried. Elagabalus lunged forward, but a dozen arms held him down, still clutching a scrap of veil in one hand. The crowd spat. Some laughed. One woman and an old matron who had once served in the temple turned away in tears. There were no speeches, no judgment, no trial, not for fear, the gods, but for disappointment. Rome had a new emperor, unclean, or was he a visionary crushed beneath the weight of an empire's fear? Was he wicked, or simply was he a monster, or a mirror, moldable? The morning came, gray and wet. No sun, no sign. The Praetorians arrived not as guards, but as hunters. Here you are. Then they turned to her, and they made the emperor watch. The man he called husband was strangled with a curtain cord. Only a single command: erase him. They dragged his body from the palace like refuse. The bride of Rome, half-naked, bloodied. The boy was thrown into the Tiber, and with him, his statues were shattered. His name scratched from walls, erased from coins, struck out in red ink from official records. Elagabalus became a ghost. But ghosts have a way of staying, because even now, historians argue, was he mad? He ruled for just 4 years, and yet, still listening, a boy in a bridal veil, a god in a city of knives, the last bride of Rome. They tried to erase him. They burned his images, broke his statues, and drowned his name in the river. But stories like his don't die, they linger. In marble cracks, in forbidden texts, in the silence after the history books close. Maybe Elagabalus was a mad boy who played with power. Maybe he was a prophet born too early. Or maybe he was simply someone who dared to live as he truly was, in a world that couldn't bear to look. Either way, he ruled Rome, and for a moment Rome belonged to him.